Big update for F1 students on OPT who are looking to be self-employed. ICE released a new memo explaining what criteria they're using and what they're looking at in SEVIS terminations, and anyone on OPT that's looking to be self-employed should carefully review it and understand how it affects their OPT self-employment. In this video, I'm going to guide you through it, highlight the main issues I see in my practice, and hopefully provide you with some tips that you can use during your OPT period. First and foremost, thank you for coming back to my channel. I'm attorney Adrian Pandev. I help individuals navigate the maze that is the US government. And in this video, we're going to talk about F1 OPT self-employment. This is a topic that's very dear to my heart. I've helped very many F1 students start their startups during their OPT period and helped basically grow their companies from first an idea and then to successful startups and exits, etc. throughout their startup journey. But what this video will focus on is how you can maintain your compliance with your F1 status and immigration compliance based on this new memo that was introduced by ICE in the lawsuits that are ongoing about the SEVIS terminations. So let's quickly go over this memo. So basically what happened, and this is his background, as you all probably know, a lot of F1 students SEVIS records were terminated by the government, which resulted in litigation across the country. And in that litigation, the courts mandated that ICE produce information on how they're actually deciding which records to terminate. And in this litigation, the government submitted a document, a memo, in which they explain what criteria they're using and why they are terminating certain individual SEVIS records. So I reviewed this document. I've reviewed a lot of information regarding these cases, and I want to summarize my main takeaways and how they impact OPT self-employment. So first, let's start with regular OPT and let's just quickly review the rule. If this is the first time you're hearing about OPT self-employment, please watch the other videos I've recorded on this. I've also had written articles on it. But the bottom line is there are three main rules that you have to follow, right? You have to have all of your business licenses for your business. You have to be actively engaged in the business. And the business and your role within it has to be related to your field of study. These are the three main requirements for regular OPT self-employment. Just to clarify, this is not STEM OPT. I'm going to cover STEM OPT in a little bit. This is about your regular initial 12-month OPT period. So while most people, or many people I should say, reach out to me about the business licenses and how they can form companies and how to make the business compliant with the immigration rules, the place where I see the most issues is the actively engaged in requirement. I've had so many individuals reach out ever since the SEVIS termination started, where they tell me, look, I formed an LLC, I did that, so I should have the business licenses, but I didn't do anything. I was searching for a job. I formed the LLC. I went and reported it in, SEVIS and SEVP and told the school that I'm working for this LLC. But not only did I not do anything, I also don't have any records proving that I did, any work. So the issue with that is that it's going to be incredibly difficult to prove that you were actively engaged in this business. So just to highlight this, because this was one of the listed items in the ICE memo in which they're looking for, which is compliance with your F1 status. So if you formed a company, right, you claimed that you're self-employed on OPT, but you didn't do anything, you weren't actively engaged in this business, that's a big problem. You have potentially violated your F1 status. So what I tell everyone is, first and foremost, be actively engaged in the business, right? Like, don't just form a company and think that solves the issue. It does not, right? That doesn't mean that you're now employed for OPT purposes, right? The second thing is good record keeping, and it's absolutely critical. So let's break both of these down in a little more detail, and hopefully it's helpful to you. So first and foremost, regarding the actual actively engaged in part. People always ask me, well, how many hours is actively engaged in? How many hours do I have to prove, and document? What I tell everyone is that the way generally, right, when it comes to OPT status and just immigration rules in general, 20 hours is treated as part-time, right? And at about, call it 35, 37 and a half, 40 hours, you're full-time employee, generally speaking, right? So if you don't have any other jobs, right? If your OPT self-employment, if your own company is the only job you have, I've, for a very long time, many, many years, advised all of my clients to be employed full-time and basically work those 37 and a half, 40 hours or whatever it is, because it's going to be very hard to question your active engagement if you were employed full-time. Now, if you have another job, right, and you're doing OPT self-employment on the side, which you're allowed to do, you can have more than one job, well then of course part-time employment works too, because you can only give this business, that amount of hours because you have a full-time job. But even if you're only doing it part-time, I advise everyone to at least work 20 hours a week on the OPT self-employment business so that you can still demonstrate that active engagement. It's absolutely critical, right? The second part of what I just said is, documentation. How are you going to document this? And this is, I have a lot of people reach out who actually did work for the business. For example, they, were developing a software and there's a lot of coding and a lot of background work, but they haven't really documented any of it. And this comes up a lot too, and it's a major issue because generally speaking with immigration, you're not submitting, you're not going and speaking to people on the phone, you're not getting questioned in person. It's all on paper. It's all documents or PDFs submitted online, but it's all paper documents. So if you're not building that paper trail, it's going to be very hard to document what you did, especially if you have to do it well in the future when you apply for adjustment of status or a visa or change of status. So here's what I tell everyone, right? You need to understand that record keeping is absolutely critical. If you're going to be self-employed on OPT, it is just an absolutely critical component like a critical compliance component. And here's what I tell everyone. First and foremost, create a work email so that all your work-related correspondence you have in one inbox that's related to the company that you can, print out. And if ever asked, you can show, hey, look, this is all the correspondence I had proving that I was actively engaged in it, right? Because if you're actually running a business or have an important role in the business, it's going to be hard to do without an email, right? Similarly to this, bank accounts, right? Especially if the business is making money, have a bank account, have a online merchant services account like Stripe or whatever. So if you're making any money, right? If there's revenue, well, those bank statements and transaction statements are going to prove that something was happening, right? Like nobody makes money without actual active engagement, or very few people. So the bottom line is, have that, make sure you have set up your banking properly and you're not just using your own personal checking account, which is going to make it extremely hard to prove this. And then finally, document your work, right? And this is going to be very industry specific, job specific. I can't tell you exactly what to do, right? But make sure, like if you're creating anything, do screenshots, do some kind of log, print what you're working on, but save it, right? Save what you're working on and have some kind of log of, hey, this week I did this week I did that. And that way you'll be able to present documents to the government proving your active engagement. And then finally, what I tell everyone is keep a timesheet. There's so many free online timesheets. You can find them everywhere at this point. There's no excuse not to do this. And yes, you do it yourself. It's not as strong evidence as, anything verifiable like the, emails or bank statements or something like that. But it's still evidence and it proves that you took the requirements seriously. So I tell everyone, when you start working, have different projects for the tasks, for the projects you're working on behalf of the business, and just, keep track your time. And then you'll be able to, if ever questioned in the future, you'll be able to print a report on all the time you committed to the business and right in your role within it. And that's yet another piece of evidence that you can use to prove that you're actively engaged in your business. So that's really it for regular OPT, again, please be very careful with the actively engaged in requirement. Most people that I see fall short, that come to me worried because they receive RFEs, etc., fall short of this. I've seen a couple Reddits. Initially, when I first wrote the article on this and first started helping people, there was not much information about this online. I feel like many have discovered this option now, and I've seen it on Reddit. I've seen it a lot of places, and there's a lot of misinformation. Just to clarify this one more time, I've done it a million times, but I'm gonna do it one more time. Just having an LLC is simply not enough, right? Just because you formed a company doesn't prove active engagement. You have to be actively engaged. And anyway, I hope the first part of this video helps you make sure you comply with that requirement. Now let's move on to STEM OPT, because STEM OPT is significantly more complicated, and I see significantly more issues with STEM OPT and significantly more misinformation online. So let's go through quickly the requirements for STEM OPT. So first and foremost, think of it as the same requirements as regular OPT apply here too, but there's quite a few more, right? So the company, in addition to having its regular business licenses, will have to be E-verified. The employer has to be registered with E-verify. The beneficiary, right, the F1 student that works for the company on STEM OPT has to work at least 20 hours. There's no more what qualifies as just active engagement. It's a minimum of 20 hours is mandated by the rules. Then you need a bona fide employer-employee relationship. I'll talk about this in a second. In addition to the bona fide employer-employee relationship, the employer has to submit a form I-983. The employer supervisor completes this form, and then actually the student generally submits it to the DSO, to the international office at the school. But the employer has to furnish you with this 983 form. And then finally, you have to be compensated. It's absolutely critical. It's a requirement. You have to receive compensation that's commensurate with others, at the company, or generally others in your field in a similar role. So here's where I see a lot of issues, and then there are many. Most people, or not most, but many people come to me because of E-verify. E-verify is the easiest part of this, to be honest. Like if you, if the company actually wants to, have you work for them on STEM OPT, registering with E-verify, enrolling in E-verify is incredibly easy. Like that's the least of your worries here. And I'm always surprised when people reach out because of that, given how easy it is to do that. Where people fall short are the bona fide employer-employee relationship, the 983 form, and the compensation. These are the three places where I see huge issues. And to be honest, I again blame the internet for this a little bit, because I've seen a lot of posts online. I've seen them, again, not through single out Reddit, but it's where I've read some of this stuff where they say, oh, just create a board of directors and then you'll get equity compensation and then there shouldn't be any issues. Now, I want to break this down a little bit and go into detail on all three of these, because while some of this advice is not necessarily incorrect, it can practically lead the individual who's followed it into a lot of issues, right? So let's start first and foremost with the bona fide employer-employee relationship, right? So I have been saying this forever, that you can't just create a board of directors and own 100% of the company or 75% of the company as an F1 student on STEM OPT, and just have that director as your buffer. And given this new ICE memo and seeing that the government does want to enforce compliance across the board, anyone that has done this or is thinking about doing this more accurately should not. And I'll tell you why. Because simply put, if you look at this from a corporate law standpoint, right, or just employer-employee relationship standpoint, if you're the majority shareholder and you can vote all those shares, then you elect the board of directors. Shareholders elect directors, and then the directors appoint the officers, right? But that means that you, as the shareholder, can fire that director at any time. So it doesn't really create a bona fide employer-employee relationship, because in fact, you're the one that can fire the director, not the other way around. Now, I understand you can create a role for you, and technically the director can be the CEO and they can fire you, but that's not necessarily 100% accurate from a corporate law standpoint. And where I really, really want to caution people with this is that for H-1Bs, right, there is a memo out there that actually says this can work. If you properly structure a company under H-1B, you could own up to 100% of the company as the H-1B beneficiary, as long as you have a director and as long as you've created a separation that has allowed you to be fireable under this legal framework. Unfortunately, for STEM OPT purposes, we do not have a memo confirming this. So a lot of people just assume, oh, this is how it's done for H-1B, so it's the same for F1 STEM OPT. I'm not convinced at all. There's nothing that says that, right? And generally speaking, if you take the plain language of bona fide employer-employee relationship, it doesn't mean that you own the company, especially if you own it 100%, and then your appointed director is somehow creating a bona fide employer-employee relationship. It's just not how it works. So given this new ICE memo and how obviously F1 compliance has become important, especially during the OPT period, right? I'm going back to what I've always said. You cannot be a majority shareholder, interest holder in this company under STEM OPT, right? Under regular OPT, the rules are different. You're allowed to do that, but not under STEM OPT. And the way I explain it to people is that actually STEM OPT self-employment is a bit of a misnomer. The way I see it is it's more you have interest, ownership interest in a company for which you work. That's a much better way to think about STEM OPT. So then, magical question I always get is, can I have, is it 10%, 5%, 20%? It's really case by case, and I don't, it's very hard to give you an answer on that in this video, but the bottom line is, under no circumstances do I think someone on STEM OPT can have majority interest, 50% or more, in a company and comply with the employer-employee bona fide employer-employee relationship. I just don't think it works. I know others disagree on Reddit, but I just told you why I'm sticking with the way I'm structuring these companies. And I think most of my clients feel peace of mind because they followed this advice. Now let's move on to the second issue I see, which is the 983 form. I see a lot of issues with this one. And what makes me kind of sad is that technically the international offices at the school, the DSO should be reviewing it, but there's mistakes made there too. And then the STEM OPT period is approved. But then what happens is once the issue is discovered, it could jeopardize basically the F1 status, and it could lead to a SEVIS termination. So a couple of very, very critical things about the 983 form. So the first thing that I've seen people argue or try to achieve is have someone abroad be the supervisor, right? And I have a big issue with this. While I don't have an issue with people abroad owning ownership interest in the company, I don't see an issue with that because that's fully allowed and it's very common among many businesses, right? But when it comes to the 983 form, if your supervisor lives abroad, right, that signs that form, well, how are you getting practical training in the US and how's that person supervising you here? Now, again, people will argue, look, work from home, they can do it over the internet. I get it, but if it's all work from home and it can be done over the internet, why are you not getting the practical training outside the country, right? Again, there's not a lot of clarification. That's the whole problem with this, right? There's a lot left up to interpretation. But on my end, the supervisor signing the 983 form should be in the US, ideally should be in the same location as you, or same city. If you're working from home, at least be able to meet so they can actually supervise you, provide you feedback so you can get that training that the program is about, right? But at a bare minimum, the individual has to be inside the United States, in my opinion. In addition to that, right, the 983 form cannot be signed by someone who is in another non-immigrant status, especially another F1 student. I've seen this too, where people are saying, oh, my co-founder is another, F1 student. We both signed each other's forms and, somehow it got through the DSO's office. Please don't do that. It should be someone that's I would say a U.S. permanent resident at least, but should have employment authorization, right, to work freely in the U.S., ideally a U.S. citizen or permanent resident. The way the rule is written, there's a bit of an exception to this in some cases, but the bottom line is definitely no other F1 student, co-founder, and generally no one on another visa that doesn't give them, free employment authorization to supervise you and work in this business. Absolutely critical. And then finally, this is the one where I see a lot of issues, to be really honest, and it's the compensation piece. So this goes back to the documents, right? And how, if this issue comes to light, how do you prove that you complied? It's again going to be on paper. And I've seen this argument over and over and over again, that equity compensation, so basically you got ownership interest, you got stock in a company, is compensation. I'm not disagreeing, right? I work with startups day in, day out. I help them, with these stock incentive agreements. Like we do this stuff all the time at my firm. I don't disagree with you. Equity compensation is compensation. I think from a legal standpoint, call it corporate law, startup law, you're absolutely right. Here's the problem. When the average immigration officer, whether it's a consular officer or USCIS officer, right, is reviewing a case, right, in which you have to prove maintenance of status, they usually want to see a W-2 form, maybe pay stubs, maybe a tax return, proving that you actually worked, right? Because the whole concept of OPT requires you to work. And for STEM OPT purposes, you're required to work at least 20 hours, right, a week. So their expectation is to see that W-2. And if they don't see it, then they're going to question, wait, did you actually maintain status? So what you can do, you can get into an explanation, right? And if you get an RFE, you can explain to the officer that, no, look, I'm a founder of the company. I got equity compensation. I got stock in the company. And as a founder, I'm not required to be paid because I'm an owner of the company. My advice to everyone is do not attempt this. I'm not saying it will never work, not at all. I just think the risk is simply too big, because if it doesn't, if the officer doesn't like the argument because they view employment as, regular employment where you're getting a pay stub, etc., you could end up with a denial of that change of status case. Not only that, you may have jeopardized your current immigration status during your F1 period. So the bottom line is, I just don't want you to, and I don't advise anyone to get into I'm explaining to an immigration officer how equity compensation works type of scenario. I don't think it's worth it. I think it's too big of a risk. And as a whole, with recording this whole video, that's kind of my main point, is that I think there's so much talk all of a sudden compared to a few years ago about OPT self-employment and STEM OPT self-employment all over the internet, and people are taking more and more liberties. And I want everyone to be extremely cautious. I've always said this in everything I've ever said about OPT self-employment. The problem is that if you make a mistake, it will most likely come up later when the government reviews your maintenance of status, when you're filing for, new visa, change of status, adjustment of status, whatever it may be. It's going to be too late to go back and fix this. So how do you protect yourself? You do it right from the get-go. So for STEM OPT purposes, please pay close attention to the 3 areas I mentioned. That's where I see the issues. And then for OPT purposes, check out the actively engagement piece that I talked about a little bit earlier. This video is getting longer than I anticipated, but I really hope that it's helpful. I really hope that you follow what I'm saying in this video, and that you do your best to comply with these criteria and don't take them lightly. I didn't record this video to talk bad about anyone posting online on those forums I mentioned. It's more about the fact that there's a new ICE memo. It highlights how critical F1 compliance is during the OPT period. And given that SEVIS records have just recently been terminated for things as little as a speeding ticket, one of these violations could cost you, your F1 status and your future in the US, and I do not want that. So anyway, I hope the video was helpful. If it was helpful, please like it and follow the channel. I'll try to post more helpful content. If you have questions about any of this, post it in the comments, or if you have any comments about this topic, post them in the comments, and I'll try to record more videos like this to, provide general advice that may be helpful to you as you're navigating US immigration. Thank you so much for watching. Bye-bye.